art, her loyalty to her art.
She said that you and I were her favorite children. Her art.
Art?
Yes, art, paintings.
Regarding love and art.
Every little brush stroke that you see in this photograph, but you only think that's what you're doing because really, because of combinatorial explosion, there's so much more there that you didn't include than what you included.
Yeah, we're trying to live and dying simultaneously, right? Like, so you were talking about how the universe and art mirror each other.
Yeah. So,
well, great.
Nice to meet you, Rob.
Yeah, it's super nice to meet you as well. I'm trying to expand outside my network a little bit because most of the people I talk to are deep into John Vervaeke's work, and you're much more eclectic.
Yes.
And yeah.
So how did you find out about the meaning code?
Yeah, so John, I've been friends with him since right before he kind of became famous and his series caught fire and everything. And so I love philosophy and art and learning new things. And John talks super highly about your channel. I think I've heard him 5 or 6 times explicitly saying like more people should be interested in this YouTube channel. And I listen to him because he's a smart guy. He pays attention and has good ideas. So I'm like, ooh. And the word meaning's right there as well. And I think too, I genuinely love your art. Like I notice my background's plain white. You've always got this beautiful art in your wherever the corner is positioned of your camera, and I go, oh, that's awesome. It's really and I after watching I think a couple of your videos, I'm like, oh, I bet she makes that. I bet that's not just bought. Am I right about that? I don't think I've ever heard you.
Oh yeah. And in fact, I don't know if you've watched any of the videos that has the new intro on it, but the new intro has a series of cello players.
Oh yeah, it's beautiful.
Yeah, and I painted all those. So
yes, I saw. Yeah, again, I kind of made that assumption
mm-hmm.
In good faith, and yeah, it's so I love that. I think I love philosophy because I definitely love ideas, but also just like I like the idea of like living a good life and making better choices, and so art to me like is beauty and makes the world better, and I just it's great to see people that are interested in science, right? And I have heard you talk about economics very articulately, and all these different things, and still not lose touch. In fact, like quite the opposite, like embrace beauty and pattern and all of the color and all of those things. So yeah, so I love that. And
well, it's kind of like walking the fence or something, like walking a razor blade, because to maintain my interest in science, I have to engage the left hemisphere to such an extent that oftentimes I find I start losing a grip on the creative side. But when you said art makes the world better, I think we could stop before we get to better even. We could just say art makes the world, because that's what I've been exploring for the last 4 or 5 years with my channel, is the ways in which the making of art corresponds very closely to everything that we find in science and physics and biochemistry and
yeah,
just
expand
every
on
aspect
that.
of knowledge.
Yeah, how do you mean, or what's a really good example of like a place that's really obvious maybe?
Okay, well, just one simple one would be for myself, the way that I learned to generate creativity was by working within very strict constraints or limitations. And
I go ahead, I'm sorry.
well, no, I mean, go ahead. You bounce off of that. We can talk about it.
Well, I was going to say, I was watching, I went to your channel and did the search and then put the word art in and watched you dialoguing with a female artist that lived, I think, in the Northeast.
Mm-hmm.
And you were kind of sharing with her your creative process. And it was kind of like the way in economics, constraints breed creativity. And when you say to a team, no, instead of doing anything, try to do these 3 things, then they're like, oh, good, I have something to work with. not
Yeah,
like, oh
yeah.
no, I'm stuck.
Exactly, because humanly speaking, if anything is possible, then nothing is possible, right?
Right. There's the kind
Right?
of deconstructionist relative kind of trap where if you're like, oh, I'm not committed to anything, you're just a nothing. You kind of just don't become. Um, but if you say like, look, I'm just going to play with the color blue for a month, then you gain knowledge about blue, or you gain, again, like so. Just to give you a little more about me, I studied economics, and then I studied a lot of applied psychology and cognitive science, and a lot of computer science. But the whole time I was doing creative projects, I studied creativity in psychology. I took twice as many humanity classes as you need to graduate my undergrad. And if you go back enough, all I did was just read and write. And I love creativity, but I just kind of, in our culture, I go, oh, do the practical thing. So I just kept tilting into the left brain to kind of pick up on what you were saying earlier. And
Mhm.
then as an adult, I go, no, I'm missing all of that. Like all of that is great. I'm glad there's roads and trains, but I need that other half of the bigger half of myself. And art is, yeah, I would love to just hear more of what you mean by how it creates the world and how it
Well, okay,
matters.
let's just take that one thing of constraints and think about that. Um, Physics, the universe is governed, I'm using the word governed loosely, by physical laws, and it's limited by constants, physical constants. And without those in place, there wouldn't be any universe. Now, Stephen Hawking said that if you just gave him gravity, he could make a universe. I mean, not that he would make a universe, but gravity alone would be sufficient to make a universe. But then you still need gravity. And out of that still flows all of the physical constants. So constraint is right at the heart of what makes the universe what it is, and what provides the infinitely creative process of making the universe. Because the universe, if the physicists have it right, just started out with this high energy that began to clump up and then begin to make particles, and then that made atoms, and then that, and then eventually that made molecules, and then molecules eventually became cells, and so it's this creative process that starts from these very strict limitations. And but if we go back a little ways, let me start from the beginning, kind of like one of the things that Jordan Peterson talked a lot about when I was watching his biblical series like 4 years ago or something, is that, and he also talked about it in his book Maps of Meaning, that he had a question, and the question was what drove him. And that if he hadn't had the question, he probably wouldn't have discovered all the things he discovered along the way. And the way I look at it, the question is the frame. So by having a question, you sort of solve your frame problem, because now you've limited your focus down to that one thing that you're going to look at. But in the process of looking at that question, see how expansive his world became, because now he covers every aspect of knowledge, right? Mm-hmm. So for me, the question was, I've been interested in this issue of creativity for probably 20 years. I used to put stuff together to try to teach workshops about it. And as I was exploring all of these elements and principles of design and art, I used to think about how I see this everywhere. I see it in science, I see it in nature, I see it cropping up everywhere. So what's going on there? And then when I ran into Jordan Peterson and I started reading Maps of Meaning, I realized that all the stuff that I had learned through the process of making art and through the process of applying these elements and principles to the design process that I was going through, that was almost like a translator key for the book Maps of Meaning. So I could pick up the book Maps of Meaning, go to any paragraph and start reading that paragraph. And even though the content of what he was saying was extremely complicated and difficult and required a lot of education that I didn't have, I could translate it into art and understand it immediately. And I thought, now that's a very peculiar thing. Why would that be so? So that became my question, to figure out why art works as this sort of translation to all these other aspects of knowledge. And so that's what I began exploring with my channel.
Okay, so let me see if I'm following this well. So there's a universe and it's got some simplicity to it, but from these simple things, they interact and their uniqueness becomes a new level of uniqueness. And then that becomes kind of a new simplicity, and another level kind of builds on that. And that's a creative process. Does that so far feel good or seem fair?
Yes, I mean that would be, I mean, I think what you're describing there is what John would call kind of a bottom-up emergence.
Yes, definitely.
Right? Okay. But before you can have the bottom-up emergence, you also have to have the idea or the spark or whatever you want to call it. This top-down emanation has to work with the bottom-up emergence so that you have this this rising up towards, so that this you could almost call it a longing, that things have a longing to fit together and to become more complex and to rise up. Jonathan Pageau talks about it a lot when he talks about the hierarchy, that which is at the top of the hierarchy is always going down to the bottom of the hierarchy to help the bottom of the hierarchy to move up the hierarchy. And even before I ran into Jonathan Pageau, I was thinking about that a lot because I remember, I think it's 4 years ago, I had a talk with Paul Vanderklay, and I was explaining to him my vision of kind of what makes the art world unique, at least the art world that I was inhabiting at the time. In many other disciplines, people tend to be extremely competitive and kind of stepping on each other's shoulders to get up the ladder. But in the art world I was inhabiting, it's as though we know that we are all in a process and we're all on a string and we're all somewhere on the string. And the people who are a little bit further along the string than we are perfectly willing to reach back and help us and give us knowledge of what they've learned on the path. And then we receive that knowledge and then we pass it on back to the people behind us. And so we're always helping each other move along this string. But if you could imagine that if that were happening in every domain of knowledge, so that you had all these strings moving up a hierarchy, then you could think about how the one that is even above and beyond all that is furthest along the string is always reaching back and helping and drawing up. So it's this bottom up emergence and this top down emanation working together.
Yeah, and even this like middle collaboration, right?
Yeah.
So there's the which could be the emergence or those things kind of, but yeah, so and I like where you're coming from, and I very much appreciate, like I said, I took a lot of humanities classes and I love artists, and I'm trying to recapture that part of my soul, so to speak, in the last 5 years, I think. And yeah, like harmony is a really cool concept, like in Platonism and Pythagoreanism and that kind of Greek tradition. It's not like one note is the best note and all the other notes are lesser notes. It's how they relate to each other and that they relate well, right? Because disharmony is also emanating down or like in that field of interaction or something like that. But when there's harmony, it's electric, it's alive. So I again, I see where you're coming from. It's a very abstract because you're like holding science, which is so precise and specific, and then this other thing that's like mysterious but meaningful and creative, and yeah.
I've been trying to figure out a way. I need somebody who's more skilled in graphic art than I am.
Mhm.
I've been trying to figure out a way to illustrate this idea, but
Yeah.
when you think about, you're talking about holding in tension this scientific side and then the artistic side. One of the books that I explored on my channel with Michael was a book by Owen Barfield called Speaker's Meaning.
I love Owen Barfield.
Yeah. So in that book, he talks a lot about this binary of accuracy and expression.
Okay.
That when we're communicating or language requires a balance of accuracy and expression, because if you have too much accuracy, it would be like Jordan Peterson's rigidified order.
Yep.
And if you have too much expression, it becomes like chaos, right? So there has to be a balance, but that balance is context specific, always context specific. So in the rules of the game of design, and those rules were not generated by any particular artist or person, but they're rules that have been observed as being effective in communicating with the viewer. Those rules have a list of elements that show up in every painting. I think they probably also show up in every piece of music and in every book. But anyway, there's these set of
No, that's the
elements.
fun of learning little domains, is they
Yeah.
have their own language for those rules. And
Right, yeah.
being a great painter, then you go into sculpting and kind of rediscover how they show up, or different ones
Yeah.
that are in the different form, and communicate through those different mediums, maybe.
Painting are the elements, and the elements are line, size, shape, direction, color, value, and texture. You'll see those to some extent or another in every work of art. But then those, and that would be kind of if you looked at it just very pragmatically, that could be your accuracy side, okay?
Okay.
But then
like
on the
this.
other side, on the expression side, you have the principles of art, and those are unity, harmony, contrast, dominance, repetition, variation, gradation, and balance.
Wow, so this is very platonic, because there's like
Yes.
the particular and the universal almost.
Yes.
Oh, this is wonderful. And
Yeah.
when
and
you
so-
when you do them well, right, there's beauty, and when you don't do them well, there's falling away or something like that.
Yeah. So
Wow.
on the expression side, if you take, for example, take repetition, for example. One of the mantras of an artist, typically, especially if you're working in non-objective or abstract art, but you're trying to make something beautiful. If you make a mistake, make it again.
Yeah.
Okay, because then you can create a kind of what is the word? Non-identical repetition. And so this non-identical repetition moving around the frame draws the eye, and the eye has a place to follow the trajectory and enjoy the journey. But you wouldn't want to overdo repetition. If you overdo repetition, you get something like wallpaper.
Yeah.
Okay, if you underdo repetition, then you don't really have harmony, because the elements of the work are not united.
Right, and that's the same in science, right? Because if you're studying a phenomenon and there's nothing in common between the various experiments you do, you don't have a scientific observation or insight or anything. But if it's so specific that it probably doesn't even matter to the world, or it doesn't, like, all people have skin is not going to be like the front page of a top tier science journal, right? It's repetition everywhere. It's the truest. I used to teach research methods because I love teaching. And so when I was in graduate school, I would teach, and I was, that you have to kind of instill that any idea doesn't make a science experiment. And so you can use a really like bad idea. So yeah, so I really, now I'm starting to resonate and see what you're interested in or what you're about, so to
Yeah.
speak.
Okay,
Yeah.
so let's take another one of the principles, dominance.
Right, I heard you talking about that with this on your podcast. Yeah.
Okay, so well, just briefly for those who didn't hear it, the idea of dominance is that when you want to bring unity to a piece, one of the things that happens with these elements and principles is that you can't be thinking about them while you paint. Otherwise, it would be like thinking about your scales when you're playing a piano piece. You can't be thinking about that, or you wouldn't be able to play with emotion and with beauty and everything else. So you paint, you internalize these things,
Right.
and then you paint. And while you're painting, you stop occasionally, step back and say, okay, do I have unity? Do I have harmony? Do I have enough contrast? And as you're looking at it, let's say you're looking at it, you're saying, for some reason, it's not unified. What's the problem? Well, one of my big problems when I'm painting is that I always tend to do things kind of half-half. I have
heard you say
half
that, yeah.
large shapes.
Which
and half
makes sense,
small
because if
shapes.
you want to be fair to all the elements and represent everything fairly, then you might bias in that direction. But then there's no, like you're saying too, even with the repetition, there's no real story or uniqueness when it's an equiprobable creation or something like that. So
Yeah,
by
exactly.
yeah, and we're such an anti-dominance thinker of a society right now. It's like, oh, dominance, that's a trigger warning or something. But it needs to be about something that is different from all the rest of the world or something like that.
Well, so there's a couple of things in
Yeah.
there. One of them is that disequilibrium is very, very important for the development of complexity.
Yeah, that's true in Zen too. They
Right?
point that out in
Yeah.
some of the studies.
Well,
I've done.
it's true in all the realms of science as
Well,
well.
we're in disequilibrium right now. We're trying to live
Yeah.
and dying simultaneously, right? Like, so you were talking
Yeah.
about how the universe and art mirror each other. And
Yeah.
so it makes perfect sense that would be just a dominant theme, because the most beautiful flower, part of its beauty is it's temporal, right? It's not going to be
Yeah.
there forever.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. So that's one of them. The other thing is when we, because of the way we've been drilled into us by the world, we tend to think of dominance as something that is like at the top of the hierarchy. They're gonna, it's gonna be oppressive. But in the art world, when you're talking about bringing unity to a painting, and dominance means you do about like 80% of something. Let's say your painting is 75, 80% light and 20% mid colors and dark. So you have a little bit of black in there, you have a few bright colors, and then most of the painting is white. That would look like a circus painting, maybe. It would be very pretty, very cute. You'd have lots of bright colors and a lot of white background or very light background. It would be very cheerful. But you could also have a painting that is 70% dark and like 20% light moving through it, and then just a pop of color someplace.
Yeah,
that would be like a really bright graphic design, right? It would really catch your eye. But you're not looking at the thing that's the 75%. That's just there to bring unity. What you look at is that little piece, whatever that little piece is. If it's a little piece of color, or it's a little piece of unusual texture, or a little piece of the opposite of what everything else is, that's where your eye goes. So the dominance is there as a support and encouragement for the focal point.
Okay, and that makes a lot of sense, right? Because it's the whole composition that you're trying to think of. And I heard you talk about in your work, like you try to play with foreground and background in the way you compose your images. And I was like,
Yeah.
oh yeah, because I was telling Sevilla, I was like trying to describe what I liked about what I had seen of the art you did, and it was kind of like that it's open and structured at the same time, and that like then you said, oh, I play with the foreground and background purposefully, and I was like, oh yeah, that's kind of this, like a smarter way of saying what I was kind of just internally making sense of it, and it's really. I took art classes, and I love film, and like Akira Kurosawa is one of my favorite filmmakers, and I was watching like the last couple of days just different people talk about how the principles he used and how he uses motion, and even if it's a really simple scene, nature is like saying something in the background. There's wind a lot in his movies, or dripping water or whatever, and so it's familiar, but it's there to like draw you in to then let you be drawn into the real thing that's there. And it's like, how do people figure this out? It's such a cool way to see these masters. And like you said, like art is so much more intergenerational, and they do pass down their secrets to the students, and it's not as competitive. Whereas, well, you know, like a Kentucky Fried Chicken, they don't ever tell their secret, or Coca-Cola, right? It's all about competition, and information is power. But artists want to empower their students, and they're excited to share their craft. And again, as like a kind of a conceptual embodied person, I just love that stuff, because then you can go out. I was listening to your podcast, and you see the way people design parks, and you go, oh, there's lines and curves and foreground and background and all these different things, that once you have the kind of vocabulary and the appreciation, these engineering things become more meaningful to you. And when you the Ringling Museum is really near me, and the Dali Museum, and there's lots of different little museums, and you go, okay, I feel this is good, and that's what a little kid would say. But then if I can have a little bit of appreciation for why it feels so good, or why it's like, I love just good art. To me, good paintings, like your eye is almost drawn around it, and it's like, oh, you just took me on a little like roller coaster.
Yes, it's
and
exactly
it was so fun.
Yeah, you should be going on a journey. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, and it just, that doesn't really occur without some teacherly transmission, or some kind of curiosity that you've gathered. So
Well, one of the ways that the classic artists used to take people on a journey is with edges. Now, you don't run into edges so much in a lot of contemporary art. Well, I mean, there are always edges, but
sure. I knew you were saying something deeper than there was shape being shown. Yeah.
But the traditional artists used to use edges to drive your eye towards what they considered the focal point of the painting. So let's say you have a figure, a woman in a dress or something like that. To the untutored eye, it might just look like a photograph. You know, especially if you're looking at it from a distance, often they did look almost like photographs. But what makes them more beautiful than photographs is when you get up close to it, it's not everything is all in your face at exactly the same time. You're drawn to a particular place in the painting, but what draws you there is along the edge of her dress, where her dress meets the background. It will be a very muted, soft, blurred edge until you get much closer to her face. And then that edge will get sharper and sharper, and there will be more and more contrast between dark and light until you get up to her face, and then everything will be in focus.
Just like the eye, right? Like I'm noticing the details of your face more than I'm noticing your shoulders or your lower, like as you get further away, because of you could even draw in like Peterson and the hierarchy of prioritizing. And okay, I'll give a little less metabolism to the fringe, and the most to the highest thing. It's so amazing.
Somehow those artists understood how the eye worked. I mean, we do that now. We try to set up photographs in that way so that the camera will focus on a particular place, make everything else.
They used AI. That's how Da Vinci figured it out. He just had his iPhone do all the work, right? Yeah, we're so spoiled, right? Like we have algorithms that can. I was so naive to this, and I have like college students say like, "I'm so upset. My best friend's filtered pictures are so fake on Instagram, and I'm like, what are you talking about? And then I'd learn and go, oh, they're exactly what you're saying. They're using things to make the tones pop or mute and make certain things blur. Like, was it bokeh in photographs? Is like they want. I'm like, what, they want a blurry thing in their picture, but that's exactly right, because it's like you want. It's like, I forget the author, The Princess and the Toad. There's this princess and she walks around as this ugly person, but it makes her look better, right? It's not just she's foolish, but she wants to be contrasted on purpose. And these, insightful principles are, again, it's just so interesting, because if you can appreciate philosophy or art or music, it's free. Your character makes you happy rather than your possessions and I was so impressed by your story. You were saying you were taking the same class over and over again, working with this person. And I love Bruce Lee. He has this quote. He says, I don't fear the person that practices 10,000 things once. I fear the person that practices one thing 10,000 times. And I'm just listening to you, and I'm like, wow, that's so awesome that you can keep making 20 versions of the same picture and wanting to know the principles more than like moving on once the novelty wears out, and you just never are great. So I was just so impressed and happy when you were sharing that on these couple episodes that you had talked about with art, and now it's so meaningful to you, right? Like you can just hear when you talk about it and see that you're thinking about it, and you've grown because did you get into art later, or how does that fit into
I started painting when I was 50.
Yeah, that's so impressive. Like cynical people say no one changes after 30, and it's like, no, you can become a really awesome, intelligent, creative person if you're just willing to put in the time and energy and humility, probably, to make those mistakes enough to become so competent. And then Jonathan Peugeot talks a lot about how, like, and other people, like, we've just lost participation. Like we're always the audience, or consuming, or but art, you can now with Photoshop or these different things for a very reasonable amount of money once you've done it. And art can be very expensive too, but you can have so much joy. I do origami, and going from like the first origami to the 50th one and seeing that you can do these more complex things, it's really exciting. Like you see yourself doing things you thought you couldn't do, and like it sounds like you just did that in a really awesome way. Again, like I told Sevilla, how like I love it. I love what you're doing, and it's really cool.
Well, I would like to say a word to the younger people who might be listening.
Yes, please. I think that's part of why I liked you here.
I wasted many, many years. So I was a little bit interested in art in college, but I didn't pursue it. I had to take one art class, and it was kind of a stupid class. I think we made African masks or something.
Okay.
What did we know about African masks,
Yeah.
And it was probably a compendium of a whole lot of stuff, because I also remember making little enameled pieces of jewelry or something. But we did a bunch of different things. It was kind of almost like they used to make fun of the basket weaving classes that that the hippies did.
Although that's making a comeback. People are like proud about that stuff now. So
I was back in the hippie era, and that was what they were teaching at the college in terms of art. So I never did anything with it. And then I got married, and I had a baby and started doing life. But instead of feeding my mind during those years, I read murder mysteries. I was a big fan of Rex Stout, the Nero Wolfe series. I read every one of his books like 4 or 5 times because they're just endlessly entertaining. And I read all of the Agatha Christie, and I read a lot of science fiction, but I didn't read anything that you could even in any way call intellectual, or kind of thing that would feed your mind at all.
That's shocking to me. Yeah.
But then when I was 30, I became a Christian, And so just from that, I started reading the Bible and, of course, developing thoughts that came from that. But I didn't do anything else with my mind aside from just reading the Bible until I turned, well, 50. I started doing this art. Mainly in the beginning, it was just a little watercolor class for a few years. And then I suppose when I was 55 or so, I started taking this creativity class, and I did it 8 times. So
Who's the person that hosted that? Would people be able to find this person or any of their books or anything? Because I was like, again, I was so impressed. Who does this? Do you ever say that to people and they say, "Oh, I also took a class 8 times"?
I've tried to get him to come on my channel to talk about it, but he kind of doesn't get what we're doing over here, I think.
What's his
But
name? Yeah.
his name is E. Mike Bailey.
Okay.
I
And
don't know. Well, I don't know what the E stands for, but I can post his website, his art website.
oh, cool.
From his art, you probably won't get the impression of what it is that he teaches, but he
Okay.
put that class together for a community college, or so we have these extended universities here. I
Mhm.
don't know if you know what I mean, but like the University of Santa Cruz, which is like 50 miles away, will put an extended university class in some business building in our
Right,
neighborhood,
right.
right?
Yeah,
And
yeah, yeah.
so he developed a class for one of those extended universities. And then he offered to teach that class to our watercolor society members.
Mm.
And it became so popular that he taught it over and over and over again. So he was continually refining his material.
Yeah, yeah.
And he had this brilliant idea that came from a book that he had read by Orland and Bales called Art and Fear. It's a little short book. It's a brilliant book. I would recommend for everybody to read it. When you read the first 49 pages of Art and Fear, the universe will just open up to you. If you're reading it with a mind from this little corner, let's put it that way. So in Art and Fear, Orland and Bales tell a story of a pottery class where the instructor said to his class, I'm going to divide the class down the middle here. Everybody on the left side, your task is to make the most beautiful pot that you can make by the end of the semester. And you'll be graded on that one pot. And this side of the class, on the right-hand side, your task is to make as many pounds of pots as you can make.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's like an engineering principle, right? You iterate and learn, and trial and error and feedback. I would imagine that group one, right? The one that made many, many.
Absolutely.
Right. And
The
you're
other side
afraid, right? That's
never did anything
right.
because
That's the other point, is you're just terrified to be perfect.
yeah.
And yeah, I think
So that was his
errors are so
first
important,
principle.
right? Yeah.
That was his first principle. Brush mileage is what matters. Brush mileage. And that's why we had to do 20 paintings in 10 weeks. And that's why they had to be large paintings, because we did them at home and then brought them in. And so we'd stand up in front of class with our painting, and everybody sitting back in the audience had to be able to see it. So it had to be a large painting. Plus, large paintings don't allow you to hide your design mistakes like a small painting does.
Oh, I didn't hear that when you talked about the story before. Because yeah, I like that you said you can't complain or like self-abnegate. I forget how you said it, but you
Yes.
couldn't kind of undermine your own talent and second guess. In argument, I think it's called a Mott and Bailey, where you keep stepping back from the truth. And yeah, because I agree. I studied errors in psychology, and I love because in John Vervaeke's world of combinatorial explosion, you have to try, right? You can't learn by theorizing and just practice, like perfecting your theory and thinking, oh, I've read more and I've updated the language, but you've never you have the best theory on hats, but you've never touched a hat before or whatever it is. But if you just keep with passion trying to make hats, you'll eventually get it, right? Like kids versus adults. Kids make so many mistakes, they just don't consider them like shameful and status lowering and all these like attacks their ego. But a college student that thinks they're a straight A student and they get their first B, that might wreck them for a month or 6 months or something like that, because they're so engaged with their identity. And if you can get people into that mode where they're not afraid to play and learn by doing, yeah, and I think that's why I love that the whole idea of this person is that he sounds like an excellent educator that really there's nice teachers that don't have talent, and there's talented teachers that don't have kindness, and then there's both that aren't good educators. But then if you get all three, and you can get someone with the talent and the warmth and the kind of vision of teaching that's so sometimes almost ineffable, that like these people almost like strike upon, then they become wildly popular. Like, what was that book? I remember reading it in the 90s. Draw with the right side of your brain was Betty Edwards. Yeah,
Yeah.
like people loved that because it was like this opportunity to not take yourself seriously and to be weird and take the distraction off of yourself. And all of a sudden you go, oh, I drew better than I thought. That's really cool. Now I want to take a second step and a third step and a fourth, and so yeah, and I think this is excellent. What else is maybe valuable about that you haven't talked about before? Because that must have been just a massive part of your life, almost 8 classes of the same class.
Well, let me see what else I've got here. Well, I've probably talked about this before, but context is so important. But if you just take the process of doing a painting, you have this idea. If you just started with a white canvas, then you pick up a load of paint, you put it on, you pick some color you want to start with, you put the brush stroke on there. Now, everything that you do after that has to relate to that brush stroke. You might think, oh, I could make it not relate. I could just make chaos, but it's not that easy to make chaos. I used to do this thing where I would go to a party or a fundraiser or something like that, and I would let people come in and make chaos on the canvas. Gave everybody a brush load of paint, let them put it wherever they want to, and then at the end, I would take this chaos that they made and then I would make a painting out of it. And that's really fun and challenging to do, but I always loved the results I got from that. So I came home and I thought, well, I'll just make my own chaos because I can't just hire 50 people to make chaos for me. But it turns out you can't really make chaos, because the minute you start trying to make chaos, your brain starts wiring it together and creating patterns in the chaos that maybe you don't want those patterns, but you can't help yourself. Where if you can take somebody else's chaos, then you can see the patterns in that chaos and you can use the elements and principles to bring it into harmony.
Yeah, there's a Japanese business book I read, and the term they used is eluding me, but it was this experiment. They said, just take a piece of paper, try to put a dot on it, and try to put another dot randomly, and do that 8 or 9 times. And already in just 8 or 9 dots on a white piece of paper, and patterns start to emerge. Your things start to cluster and be related to each other, and you can't create a field of chaos. It's just impossible to do. It'll have some and yeah, even like neurobiologically, right? Like we're like the pattern mongers. I've heard people call other humans, is we're just pattern mongers, and you give people extra dopamine and they start seeing conspiracies everywhere, and they've done this in labs. I don't know if you know Michael Shermer at all.
I saw him in person one time.
Oh wow.
I listened to a few of his videos.
Yeah, so he talks about this, where they give experiments to people and they just give them a little extra dopamine, and then all of a sudden they're more gullible. They're just seeing patterns that don't exist, or at least by the scientist's point of view, they don't exist. And so yeah, we want to impose pattern, and like you said too, it's not even just like social construction. Our universe is built for pattern, and it emanates pattern into itself or something like that.
Well, what you just brought up about the inability to create chaos, I think what that points up is that if we think, because we're thinking wrongly about chaos, right? Chaos is the bed of creativity. Chaos is the generator of creativity. Chaos is where all the treasures are hidden, really, because Jordan Peterson's always talking about the walled city, and that's order, and then you go outside the wall and there's chaos out there, but there's also treasures to be found. Well, that's just the way the world works, that you have your known, but the only place where you can find anything new is in the unknown.
Right.
So that's where you got to go, right?
And
Even if the going there is painful and challenging and scary and difficult and everything else, that's the only place where you're going to find anything new.
Right, because if you think you've got your life down to a Kantian algorithm and that you figured it all out, or Europe, there are no black swans. We in our bubble have figured everything out. We no longer even need to look outward anymore. And yeah, you do. Things are always moving. We live in a dynamic equilibrium. Things are reshaping. Knowledge changes. Like I love John Vervaeke talks about how really like knowledge is heuristics, right? Like it's not that we have this is true, but it's true given all these things, and you can't not have an agent arena relationship. You can't just be an agent and say, I figured it all out. It's all inside. I don't need to go out into the arena. And and in the learning world, that's really cool, because if you take a really figured out domain and another kind of different domain and try to start making connections between the two, sometimes that just pops open all this possibility. So there's like, I was emailing you and saying I was taking classes with Tom Cheatham, and there's this book that he shared with his physicist who introduces sound knowledge into physics, and he goes like, oh, there's so much creativity here, and we're so good at constraining things down to our goal that we miss the fact that there's so much more happening than the way we're categorizing and ordering in our consciousness. And so I think you're 100% right. Like you the outsider, even in Christianity, brought up, right? Like the outsider comes in and shakes everything up for the tribe. And it's a Jonathan Peugeot talks about it much more articulately than I could now. But there's no such thing as the perfect whole. It needs the other always to grow and to change and to be connected to the moreness of things.
Well, you were just talking about the inside and the outside, and that connects back up with the whole idea of the edge in art.
Okay, yeah.
So if you imagine, let's say, the inside of a sphere, and then whatever's outside the sphere, there's still the edge that's between the inside and the outside, right? And the whole world is nested that way, of insides and outsides. And then the outside is inside of something else, which
Right.
is outside of that. And then that outside is inside of something else, which is outside of that. All of that nesting means that there have to be these edges, and the edges is where the things relate. The edge is the connecting point. The edge is the place where interchange can take place between the inside and the outside.
Oh, that's beautiful.
So if you have let's say you have an edge that's like this, where it's like puzzle pieces fitting together, right? That kind of an edge is more intriguing to the viewer than just a plain flat edge like this. And
why?
Especially especially if you want to get this push and pull between the background and the foreground, or between the inside and the outside, you want to have this kind of interlocking edge, because then the viewer has to explore that edge and has to think about all the possibilities that it might entail. But you can also think about it in terms of the boundary of a cell, because cells are built that way. They have openings and they have spaces where things can go out and other things can come in, and that's what keeps the cell alive and connected with its environment, and what allows all of the cells to work together to make something larger. So all of in any sort of work of art, you have your main boundary, which is which is the rectangle or the circle or whatever it is, whatever frame you have. And these words all work, whether you're talking about John Vervaeke's, perspectival knowing or proposite, whether you're talking about knowing or epistemology or history or anything else, you have a frame and everything happens inside the frame. And inside the frame is where the creativity is possible. So you put down your first stroke. The first stroke automatically limits what will come after that. It's no longer as combinatorially explosive
Right.
as it was before there was the first mark. And each succeeding mark further constrains the possible result. So another way to look at this is sometimes I have a painting in mind and I think, oh, I'm going to create this beautiful thing. And by the time I have 4 or 5 strokes on the canvas, I'm already redirected myself in another direction. I can't get back to that initial vision.
Yeah.
So there's something about this applying yourself and acting out and iterating your life. It's not ever going to go exactly the way you think it is going to go. Jordan Peterson used to talk about how you designate a spot that you're moving towards and you start moving towards it. But by the time you get close to it, the spot has moved over here. So you have to change direction. And then maybe.
It's amazing that our brain can accomplish even one goal because of in psychology, they talk about maximizing and satisficing. I don't know if you know about satisficing. So satisficing is this idea that I want the double cheeseburger, add bacon, 3 pickles, handful of onions. But if I'm so narrow that I only choose that to act upon, I might starve. So I have to have the ability to hold a goal in mind, but be flexible with it. Because if it's been 45 minutes and maybe I'm on a highway, like a lonely highway, even though I wanted a nice hamburger, I should pull over to the hot dog stand because what I really want is this thing called food, and it's satisfied by a second thing, not the exact object that I'm kind of able to tangibly picture. And just another example you might like in machine learning and statistics, let's say there's a 500-digit number and there's maybe 20 of them, and you want to be as efficient as possible as determining which number is which, because maybe one of them is really valuable to you. As soon as you get the first digit of this infinitely long number, that's a lot of information, right? Because if it's a 7, now all of a sudden it's not a 1 through 6 or an 8 through 0. So even that first constraint tells you a lot of differentiation about an infinitely large number. And then it's if it's 2 is the next one, well, almost nothing has a 7 and then a 2. So the sequence and this little bit of beginning actually reveals the cosmos. It reveals this giant behemoth of a number. And it's kind of beautiful in a weird way, right? That these little constraints start to really, like you're saying, push reality into itself and reveal the intelligibility of this, cosmically large number with just a little contact with it, or with a little understanding is probably a much better word.
Yeah, that's so beautiful, because if you constrain even more tightly and you just go down to the difference between 0 and 1, it's impossible to get from 0 to 1. It's impossible, because you could have 0 and then 0.00000 infinitely to 1, and then 0.00000 infinitely to 0.2. And then, even if you could get past the zeros and get to the 0.1, then you'd have 0.19874000000. If you think of how many infinities exist, there's more infinities between 0 and 1 than probably there are anyplace else in the universe.
I think that's our hope, that the AI won't take over, is because they are locked in the algorithmic binary and the universe isn't, right? In a lot of really sophisticated ways. I mean, even language goes wrong that way, right? Language is meant to temporarily convey something, and if you reify it, it'll trick you into thinking that there's meaning that's persistent, and yeah, life is so subtle, and it's infinite, like it's bounded infinity or something like that would be like a Platonic kind of description. And yeah, and it's almost like anti-depressing, right? When you appreciate the wonder of these little views, let's say these perspectives, it just makes the whole world more interesting. That's why it's so cool to learn about art principles, or about engineering principles, or genres of music. I mean, it's great to just not overthink life and go like, I like this, I don't know why I don't like this, but I don't. But there's this whole other, like you were saying, um, you know, mystery novels are awesome and they're really cool, but then this field of ideas
Yes.
is so much more vital. And that's why in academia, I felt so kind of suffocated, because once you're a professor that only studies in psychology, this B line and their brain, and it gets so niche that you can't appreciate the bigness of the universe anymore. And they do good work, and I'm glad science exists, and I'm glad for, like, half the people on your channel are some of the most interesting people on earth. So those that do the dance, Robert Sapolsky and John Vervaeke, Jordan, like these people are, they keep the wonder in the science. That's so hard to do. But yeah, it's I guess I'm just getting really excited about education, but
Yeah, well, I mean, I think we need to get more excited about education again, because I don't know, my college education was deeply poor.
yeah, what's lacking for, especially 20, 30, even 40-year-olds that are just kind of in like the meaning crisis and not getting their spark ignited by these institutions anymore? Like, maybe what was that like, or what could we be doing differently? Because you have a lot of perspective, I
Well,
think.
I mean, I don't know what other people's experiences were like, but I know my experience.
Yeah.
First of all, we all thought we were so cool. We all thought we were so hip. We all thought we knew everything, didn't really need to listen or learn,
Yeah.
and it was because it was the hippie era. We had, or maybe this was unrelated, but we had a number of professors who were fairly young, and amongst the students, the idea was that once you hit 30, it was over.
Yeah. No, that's very bad. It's like a pandemic right now. Young people just don't value elders, and like an older person. I live in Florida, like the land of the old, right? Stereotypically. And it's a shame, because I literally live in a condo with all retirees, and you talk to someone and they go, oh, I did this with my life, and I did this, and this challenge I overcame. And they're so rich. They just you learn about the Vietnam War, or the Korean War, or the Depression. I mean, those people are kind of gone almost, but like, 10 years ago, you could just run into an old person and they could give you wisdom about the Depression. And you go, oh, I don't need an iPhone 13 because I have an iPhone 4 and they're all the same, basically. But we don't think that way. And this wisdom study I'm working on, there's this great quote. I was going through these transcripts, and someone was like, I don't trust anyone over 25. That's what this young person said to this like awesome, very, very trained kind of therapeutic life coach, philosopher type person. And the person's like, well, you're going to be over 25, so that doesn't even make sense. But that's how, yeah, people don't, the rate of change of technology in society is so quick that people feel like if you're talking to someone over 50, you're getting bad news, like you're getting outdated information. Even in corporations, that they don't do it too much anymore because of lawsuits. But I remember like around 2000, they would just fire people over 50 in these engineering firms and go, oh, the oldest people are all gone. Like these hot tech companies don't want someone 45 even, because clearly they don't know what's what anymore. And it's like, that person built the architecture you're standing on right now, or and they know more about the legacy system that will be there in 30 years than anyone else on earth. And so it's such foolishness. You don't want to be nostalgic and be like, oh, I only listen to old people. I'm like where the hipsters kind of do that? Was that a thing at one point where they only into certain genres of types of people? But
Well, I mean,
yeah,
I think like I said, I mean, I don't know if it was just idiosyncratic to my college education,
no, I think it's very normal.
but a couple of the professors were under 30 and they were just having affairs with all the girl students, even though they were both married.
Yeah, yeah.
And that was just the way it was supposed to be. Um, and then they both were very full of themselves and thought one of them was an English lit professor and one of them was a philosophy professor. And the philosophy professor was so full of himself that I couldn't even take him seriously. So I didn't learn any philosophy. I took a whole semester of philosophy, but I didn't learn a thing. Well, I did learn one thing. Wittgenstein said, A is A if and only if A is A, and the grass is green if and only if the grass is green. And that's the point at which I fell asleep because he couldn't represent Wittgenstein's ideas in a way that was compelling.
Yeah, yeah.
Now I go back and I read Wittgenstein and I think, oh my gosh, there was something there that I could have profited from, right? So not that I would agree with him, but it would have bounced a lot of ideas around in my head. But
Yeah, entertaining opposing thoughts is so powerful. Just
yeah,
the Aristotle said this a lot. Like he would often start his arguments with 4 or 5 perspectives and say, okay, now that we've thought about that, let's move on to the good stuff. But he wouldn't just start with his perspective. And John Vervaeke also does this and really well is if you can't hold another belief in your mind that you don't own, that's a failure of education, because how can there be growth or consensus or yeah, and to the age thing too, I think I had a tutoring book when I first started to teach that I bought, and I remember it recommended like a principle of like, if you have 2 teachers that are equal, just go with the older one, because like you're saying, they actually have um, this harmony behind them and this whole hidden repository of knowledge and life experiences, and they've made mistakes, and they're also probably less likely to sleep with the students and be immature and stuff, right? And so I think that's a good point, and that's why our system is so anti-authoritarian and we don't trust people in power. But a good person who's been in power their whole life, like Socrates, right? Like he's very old in the dialogues, but he's the one helping the young people. Like, and his maturity actually not to sleep with the people that are attracted to him. I don't know how well you know Socrates in the dialogues, but Alcibiades. Do you know Alcibiades is this character who is historically real. He was rich, politically powerful, handsome, and athletic. And every time he's around Socrates, he's like, I don't know what it is about this ugly, old, weird, poor man, but I'm just so interested in him whenever I'm around him, because he had this charm of the dialogue and of loving the soul of Alcibiades, whereas everyone else wanted him for his looks, his power, his money, all these things. And Socrates wants to like help him understand courage and virtue and these things. And so yeah, when you cut that off and say, look, people older than the young is probably a better way to say it than old people. But people older than the young have nothing to contribute to the young minds. And it just makes the whole thing work, right? Like other species don't have grandparents, and they don't have the luxury of like 4 times as much resources to love the kids. And there's something about, I think, us as a species, that we preserved our elders. Other primates, even other animals, if you get old and weak, they just push you out. Wolves do this as well, mammals. But if you keep your elder healthy, then they're gonna love the cute little babies while everyone else is busy doing their job. Instead of a baby having 1 or 2 or maybe like a bunch of adults, they now have this second tier to do even more, and to have more memory of, oh no, actually 80 years ago, or 60 years ago, I went to Egypt and I learned this thing, and I'm going to tell it to you now as a 70-year-old. And so I think cultures that get obsessed with youth, like the French and certain periods of Roman history, it's really never worked out for those groups. Being obsessed with youth is not generally like a good signal that your society is on track. I mean, I could be wrong. History does vary, but
Well, it certainly wasn't a good sign in our culture.
yeah, no, I'm just resonating with what you're saying. Yeah.
Because a lot of those young people that I was in college with that were rebels against the system and everything, they ended up as being the new crop of college professors that also were not teaching anything very valuable and useful except their own ideas and um, their own approaches to life, because they didn't want to go back and look at Socrates and Plato, and they didn't want to go back and look at historical frameworks because they wanted to make a new world in their own image, you know,
Right.
this utopian vision. So, and somehow I think one of the big failures of education is that we haven't implanted in young people this deadly truth that utopian vision always results in coercion and death.
Yeah, there's never going to be a perfect world. You can control everything from the moment of birth to the moment of death. And I think it's innately in the structure of the universe that it's not a tragic universe, but there's tragedy in the universe. And if you try to manage it or micromanage it or erase it, it's like the sin of Lucifer, right? Like it's just an arrogant, foolish, hubristic way of approaching things. And in philosophy, right, like people love to just share their thoughts and armchair philosophy, and I don't know about Aristotle and Plato, but I'm so much smarter. Just listen to my 10 paragraphs. Whereas people like John, they're citing people. He literally went back to undergrad to get another undergrad degree rather than to go to get masters and PhDs first, to just be sure that he knew the basics of the field. Because if you don't know, it's a cliche, right? But like, if you don't know where you came from, how can you possibly know where you're going? And that's true whether you're a physicist or an economist or a philosopher, an artist. Like, it's actually really, really valuable to just say, okay, I'm not losing my uniqueness. I'm gaining an advantage by learning the history and appreciating. And they can be wrong, right? You could have horrible parents, and then in those cases, you shouldn't learn from your elders if they're, mean people. But in the world of disciplines, I think I couldn't imagine studying psychology, and you couldn't even write an introduction to a paper without knowing the field. You think, oh, I got this cool idea, and you're like, no, they've been doing that since 1920. Like, this is laughable unless you know the field. So no, I think that's exactly right. I think that's really cool. Are there other kind of tips for this generation of, especially, like 20, 30, 40, like people that just didn't get homed in these traditions of religion and education and politics and society?
Well,
really,
I think you just brought up one of them, and that is, don't get trapped in a silo. I mean, maybe that's the only thing people can do nowadays, because every job requires this very specified education to get down into this niche thing, right? But if you don't look outside your own silo, you're not going to understand how the world works at all. And I mean, this is a peripheral example, but if we go back to this idea of creating the utopia, for some artists, the utopian vision is to be able to perfectly recreate the scene that's in front of them, down to the eyelashes on the cat, okay? Perfectly. It's called photorealism. And if it's done well, it's mildly interesting to look at, but I would never call it a work of art because it's a photograph.
Why not? Yeah.
Well, it's a photograph. You could as easily have taken a photograph of this thing. What you have shown is that you have a level of skill for recreating every little brush stroke that you see in this photograph, but you only think that's what you're doing, because really, because of combinatorial explosion, there's so much more there that you didn't include than what you included, because there's also ideas and passions and feelings and concepts and all of that swirling around whatever that thing is that you're looking at. And if you only recreate where each color and shape is placed on this rectangle, you haven't recreated that world. You've only recreated one visual frame of that world.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's what happens with these, especially a lot of young people today. It's a curse of the young to want the utopian world, want the utopian vision. But vision is there for a purpose. Vision is there to show you what you don't yet have, so that you have to build the skills to get to that vision. And then when you get to that, when you get enough skills to get to that vision, you will find that the vision has moved out in front of you many furlongs. And that tells you, again, you need to build a set of skills to get to this further vision, because the vision always outruns your skill. But if you look at the vision as just something that you can force other people to accomplish, you're not going to learn, you're not going to grow, society's not going to move forward. Then we're just stuck in this stasis of one person's vision, right?
Yeah, have you seen the movie Wall-E?
Yes.
Yeah, there's this moment in it where the captain says, "We've been on this trip for 783 years and nothing has changed. Our forefathers would be really, really proud." And it's like, that's so tragic. That's exactly what you don't want to look back. You want to, I mean, it's not beautiful, the Romans and the barbarians and it's not like a pristine picture of history, but it's a moving, growing, changing, dying, rebirthing, all of those things. And if you try to just abstractly conceptualize it and live through this abstract technique or something, then you never live almost. And I think it's another thing maybe that I find kind of sad, and I fall prey to this too, is just people don't commit. They're so afraid of committing to an identity or a relationship or they I want to have my career and be a partner at the law firm and then get married and have a kid, instead of just being in that messy life, of like, oh my gosh, I'm 25, I'm not even done with law school and I have my first child. It's like, oh no, but people don't do that. And I mean, there's part of it is wisdom, and it'd be really tough to be like an 18-year-old parent in this society. So waiting till you're 25 or 27 makes a lot of sense. But if you wait till it's perfect, so you never live. So again, I love hearing when you say, like, in my adult life, I just dove into art, and it's like, oh, it's so awesome to hear someone commit to something like that, because as maybe you just had this unlocked talent and everyone else that tried it would fail, but probably you grew a lot and just transformed through the process. And if you had never committed,
absolutely. I don't think there was any innate inborn talent at all. But I want to say, I didn't just launch into this thing, oh, I'm going to become an artist. I tiptoed into I tiptoed into a watercolor class because we had moved into a house that had high ceilings and had a lot of blank walls, and I needed some art like you have behind you. I needed something to put on the walls, and I didn't like buying prints. And I would go to the art fairs, and the watercolors that I liked at the art fairs were too expensive. So I thought, well, I'll go and learn how to do this. Because of course I thought, well, I can do that. How hard can it be? And then I discovered, oh my gosh, you are terrible. You suck at this. You're like a 3-year-old. So I almost quit because it was so bad. But about the same time, I had started growing a garden in our backyard, and I had the Better Homes and Gardens pamphlet there to show me what plants to buy and where to put them in order to make this beautiful garden. And I got it all dug in and put everything where it was supposed to be, and it didn't look like a garden at all.
Okay.
And I stood there looking at it for a long time thinking, this is like my art. It's like I'm a failure at everything. I can't make anything the way I want it. And then the aha went off, oh, wait a minute. In 3 years, that garden will look like this picture. So I'm going to give myself 3 years in art. So by the time I got 3 years into it, I'm like, yeah, I can do some things and maybe I could get better. And I have a vision of what I'd like to be able to do. And
Mhm.
maybe I can pick up the skills I need for that. And so it became a process of looking at this vision, gathering skills, letting the vision move out ahead of me, gathering more skills, letting the vision move out ahead.
Mhm.
And
Yeah,
then once
because
I took the creativity class, I was just off and running because I never thought in a million years that I was creative. And then when I took that class and it just unlocked this place in my brain, I couldn't shut it off.
yeah, not everyone sees you as creative. You see yourself as creative, and it's powerful. Yeah, and I love to use kind of and stop me if I over reference John. I just think he's a really smart scientist, and
I'm
uh,
actually talking to him this afternoon, so
oh,
you won't
perfect.
over reference him for me.
Yeah, tell him Rob says hi, and it's uh you have like a future self that if you can learn to love and give them the patience and the resources and the commitment and the time, that then you become that person. But if you never like, if you think your future self is irrelevant or ugly or non-existent, then you're kind of stuck in whatever's easy and obvious, and you're never willing to risk growth or commit deeply to things. And I do contemplation exercises where I try to just love my future self and go like, okay, well, what would it be like to love that person who you could be? And what would they sacrifice? What would you sacrifice for them? Or what would you take away from today for them? And sometimes it doesn't work and it feels silly and whatever. But sometimes you go, oh yeah, I'm gonna live longer. And there is a person out there. And if I give them 3 years of, couple days of my week or whatever, I can then have a whole new skill and actually be this person that's a better writer, that isn't just winging it and intuitive, but that has learned these principles and has taken classes with teachers. Or I can be, a better digital artist. And digital art is really intimidating when you have a job and commitments, because it's like, oh my gosh, these people that are young and that had no jobs and spent 6 years of their life playing with this stuff, they're amazing at 18 and they can Photoshop this stuff. So why would I ever try? But if you say no, like you said, I'm just gonna love that future me and give them some of my time and not put pressure on my growth and stuff, then all of a sudden you find yourself this new person, and you like that person because you dreamed that person, and that person was valuable to you all along. So and again, as an adult, like adult learners, they need to really know why they're doing things. Like kids, it's great to teach kids because they just do whatever you say if you have rapport with them, and they don't really go like, what, why are you teaching me this? But an adult goes like, look, I have stuff to do, I've got I'm not that naive or whatever. But if you can rekindle that openness to grow, um, it's so cool to see yourself do things you never saw yourself able to do, or to become part of a community that you thought was too elite or unreachable. Or your podcast, like, holy moly, you talked to some pretty impressive people. Was like the first time you did that, was it nervous, or were you like, how do I ever reach out to this person? I'm sure it's much easier now. Does that mirror that growth, or was that very different maybe?
Well, I didn't really try to talk to any impressive people until about a year ago. And what happened there was that I was perfectly happy with my channel the way it was. I mean, I love talking to what we call in this little corner, we call them randos, right? I love
Okay.
talking to randos because they're really thinking and they really make me think. And it's just great. It's such a great creative area. But at a certain point, well, at one point, the channel was really growing. And then all of a sudden, I think somebody said something political, because on the next episode, the views went down to 80, and then it stayed at 80 for every
Oh,
episode.
some algorithm got triggered or something?
Yeah, it
Oh,
stayed
wow.
at 80 for like, I don't know, several months. And
Uh-huh.
then little by little, it started edging up again. And so I got to thinking about that, and I thought, you know, there are some people I would like to talk to, but I don't want them to waste their time to come on here and only get 100 views.
Right, right.
It seemed unkind to ask
Yeah.
people that. And so I went through a period of time where I started doubting the whole project. Like, why am I doing this? And maybe nobody actually cares. And so I thought, well, before I quit, I'm going to pray about it. So I started praying and asking the Lord, is there a purpose in this? Am I supposed to be doing this? Because I'm reluctant to ask people to come on now.
I agree. Yeah. It's weird to say, like, I have a small YouTube channel. You have this awesome work. Please, generously come.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I went through that period of time, and I started praying, and then this strangest thing happened, and I am not exaggerating in the least. Within the next week, I got 5 emails from people that I had not met, that I don't even know how they got my email address.
Yeah.
Saying, I love your channel so much. What you're doing is so valuable to me. And, I hope you just continue with this forever. And I'm like, okay, this is weird. So then I thought, well, you know what? I'll keep going, but I'm not going to go out there and generate business. If people come to me, I will talk to them. And so I did that for several months, and that was working just great. I had enough people where I could do 2 episodes a week, and they were fascinating, and I loved it. I met a whole lot of new people. And then I had this idea that there were people that need to talk to each other.
Yeah. People that can network in this community. I try to aspire to that as well. And there's something really powerful about connecting Wolfgang and John. It's like, oh my gosh, like that's.
Yeah. So I thought that would be a value add for them. It wouldn't be a waste of their time. It would be a value add. So if I could do that, I could talk to these higher profile people and say, I think you should talk to so-and-so. And that has been amazing.
Okay, good. I'm going to steal this a little bit, because I was intimidated to start to talk to more than one person, but I think that's actually really, really cool, because a lot of these people are so busy that they would never look to connect. And then if someone can connect them, they end up being these gems that open up this whole world. And I don't know if you know the Stoa with Peter Limberg. Yeah, like I think he's a really good connector, where you don't even know his politics and his philosophy, but he has everyone from Noam Chomsky to a system theorist that's really creative and new. And so that capacity to create a community for people is, and this again goes to science, like network science. I wrote about that in graduate school too. And it's like, you need not just the nodes, but the nodes to be connected, right? And like just a little bit of new connection, like we were saying, that metaphor of biology and art, or whatever the things you're connecting, a little bit of new random connection can burst forth into new life. So, having to be the prestigious person that can talk one-on-one versus the vehicle for connecting people, I think it's almost like a more noble skill or duty, because it breeds new creativity. And again, like that's why when I was emailing you, I was like, who are you? Because I only had seen you as this moderator.
In some ways it's easier, because I don't have to have my own ideas so much. In fact, I try very hard when I put these two together not to interfere too much, because they're there so that they can talk to each other. So I try to just facilitate, maybe give them a question to start with, and from there let it happen, and it just happens, and it's effortless after that. So the first one of those that I did, I was a little nervous, frankly. I think it was John and Michael Levin. I was a little nervous because that's a lot of firepower.
Yeah, and very different kind of firepower too. That's what's so interesting.
But yeah, after that was really good. I don't know how long I'll keep doing those matchups, because the people that are still on my list, well, actually, I can read to you the list of people
please
I
do.
think should talk to each other. Then if anybody has any contact information for some of these people, they could tell me how to make it happen. Well, I have a list of people I'd like to talk to, but then I also have a list of matchups. Where's the list of matchups? I know my papers are crinkling here in the speaker.
Yeah, take your time.
Here we go. Okay. Jordan Peterson needs to talk to DC Schindler.
Everyone needs to talk to DC Schindler. Yeah.
Yes. Ian McGilchrist needs to talk to DC Schindler.
Yeah.
And then DC Schindler and Esther Meek, I mean, she's quoting him all the time, so they probably know each other, but I would love to have the two of them on to talk about love and beauty and the role that they play in knowing. And then I think Jordan Peterson should talk to Esther Meek, because they both have this paradigm of the unknown and the known and the knower and the relationship of love to truth. And I really think Jordan Peterson should talk to Stephen Wolfram, because Jordan Peterson has been trying to find a physicist who will understand his hierarchical nature of the structure of the universe. And Stephen Wolfram is that physicist in terms of the metaphysical structure of the universe. Although Stephen Wolfram has no idea that what he's doing is metaphysics. It really
No, he's beautiful. Yeah, that's well said, right?
Yeah.
Because he just sees it as obvious. And we're all going like, wow, you're like a Neoplatonist who can articulate like what Plotinus was talking about. And this is not easy business to do without good faith. And yeah, it comes implicitly.
Yeah.
That's
and then I'd like to get Stephen Wolfram and Michael Levin together, because Stephen Wolfram has this idea about computation being fundamental. And Michael Levin has this idea about how computation works in the cells. And Stephen Wolfram is very generous about working with people from different domains of knowledge to see how it fits into his whole framework of the new fundamental physics. So I really think Michael Levin would be a good resource for Stephen Wolfram, but I did finally get an email for Stephen Wolfram, but I don't think, and I did suggest this matchup, but I don't think they know enough about Michael Levin to understand why he should talk to him, so they declined. And then Michael Levin should talk to Ian McGilchrist, because I think they could get at something about where intelligence resides at the cellular level. And especially this whole idea of the two domains in what's it called? Oppositional
opponent processing.
Yes. And I'd like Mark Vernon and Michael Levin to talk on the implications of language existing at the cellular level. So those are my wants.
No, it's a great list. That's and they're all in this kind of realm of trying to understand things less mechanically without losing the causalness of things. And it's a more alive biology and a more embodied, embedded spiritual ontology. Like in Vernon's case, he's a fun thinker to listen to. And it's just the mechanical worldview has taken its course. We need to move beyond that and get into a more alive, co-determining, interrelated kind of world. But it's tricky, right? Like it's easy to talk a little bit of lip service to those ideas, but when you hear, like Wolfram or people like that, like I studied systems and systems thinking, and I don't know if you know Alicia Herrera. I think she's one of John's best references.
I did look her up once because John mentioned her, and I can't remember now what I read about her, but I did look her up once.
Yeah, her book is
I bought her book.
Best. Yeah, it's just one of the best. She's actually in Florida. I'd like to try and meet her and then go
Now
film.
wait, the book I bought is a compendium of essays put together with just kind of an intro by her at the beginning.
No, it's called Dynamics in Action, I think is one of the
okay.
I'll send you, there's a really nice summary paper that it takes me 2 minutes to grab, and it summarizes her book. And if you enjoy that, then I would just get the whole thing, because it's cool. The intro to this, it's like a 20 or 30 page paper. It says like, this is short for my 300-page book, so read it 3 times. And it's really nice and succinct. And then when you go to the chapters in the real book, they get into the history of philosophy and what's lost and what she's valuing. And she's so coherent, and really values dynamic systems and dynamic behaviors in a way that, like, if you can start to pick up on the language and the way she thinks, for example, like Aristotle's four causes, like people criticize the modern view and say like we only use a couple of them. We're not really thinking in terms of these things because the Newtonian worldview doesn't value all the causes. And when you start pulling out some of these assumptions, you end up with this very distorted, weird kind of worldview. And she just does a beautiful. I think you'd like her a lot. I'll stop rambling facts about her, but I think I'll send you this paper.
Yeah, I would very much like that. I would very much like that, because even the one where she put together the essays, I can see the thread of where she's going with the essays, and I'm like,
she's
yeah,
very
I really
clear
like all
thinker.
these people. Yeah.
Yeah, she's another thing I kind of curmudgeon about academia is a lot of the papers are really like poorly written. The writing could be much, much, much better and clearer and things, but she's a really clear thinker and builds on arguments and uses lots of great illustrations and cites the history. And it's yeah, John says it's one of his 5 favorite books or something. So if authority persuades you.
Well, yeah, if it would help me to have a mind that was as concise as John's, yes, that would be great.
Well, just read for like 20 hours a day for 10 years and you'll probably get there. I think because he's voracious.
I don't know how he does that and still has a job and a relationship, because
well, I think he is just doesn't have a lot of hobbies. I remember in Thunder Bay he said like, when I'm not doing this, I'm like that plant over there. And he was saying like he's not social. And some of his early episodes of the Meaning Crisis and interviews and stuff, he'd say like, when I go to a party, I'm really boring. But then I would start to talk about meaning, which he was researching, and everyone would light up. And that was part of how he realized like, oh, the world cares about meaning. I'm not good at small talk, but people seem to really like this wisdom meaning stuff lately. And so I think he's the kind of person, and he's just like a razor sharp thinker. And I'm close friends with not only him but some of his friends and some of his students. And he just, every day he practices for 2 hours. He's in the morning when you're like hitting the alarm clock, trying to stay in bed a little longer. He's meditating and contemplating and praying and doing Tai Chi, and he's done 30 years. So he's given up on the triviality of life and doesn't know what movies are playing, but knows cognitive science and wisdom. And he also studied with J.J. Gibson. I don't know how familiar you are with him, but he studied with some students.
Because Wolfgang is very, very interested in Gibson's work.
Yeah, so is Peterson, right? You mentioned Jordan Peterson. He cites Gibson.
So I've had to go back and look at a lot of Gibson in order to be semi-prepared. So this afternoon I'm going to have John and Wolfgang on together again, which means I need to save a few brain cells for that.
Yeah, we can definitely. I could talk forever, and I've enjoyed this so much. We can definitely land the plane, and yeah. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed this too, and we could do this again sometime.
This was fabulous.
Oh,
very,
good.
very easy to talk to you, and you totally get what I'm saying and how it all fits with everything. And I wish I could be more articulate about how it fits with so many other things. My friend Glenn, the physicist, who's been on a number of times on the channel, I think he understands clearly how it all fits in with the physics, but it's more difficult for me to explain that because I'm not a physicist. So
it's tough. I studied expertise in grad school, and the best way to be an expert, like this really kind of clever way, is you go into a domain for about 10 years, and then you jump into a new domain for 10 years, and you just keep jumping. And because if you stay in the same domain for like 40 years, the problems get narrower and more technical. But if you don't stay enough, you don't become an expert. But if you kind of go, okay, well, I've been an artist for 10 years, an economist for 10 years, if you can really, then the neurons will start connecting almost implicitly if you try. And but it's a challenge. I mean, there's very few people that, for example, in math teaching are able to do math really well and then write it in English without any symbols. But there's like a few people that can like almost think in language of math and write paragraphs that get you to the same place that a really terse equation does. And so it's an ambitious, but I think valuable goal to try and bridge those things.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I keep working on it. Thank you for this opportunity, Rob.
Yeah, absolutely. It was great to talk to you and stay in touch and again tell John I said hi.
Okay.
All right. Great to
Okay,
meet you,
bye-bye.
Karen.
Nice to meet you too.